What's up, everybody? I'm back with part 3 of the state's response to Kathleen Zellner's newest filing on behalf of Steven Avery. I will link part 1 and part 2 in the description below in case you are interested to go back and see what is at the beginning and middle parts of this filing by the state. Finish it off here in this video, so let's jump right back into it. This is right where we left off. It is not the state's burden on Avery's third collateral motion to eliminate Bobby as the individual who made the searches, nor definitively disprove any of the rest of Steven Avery's conjecture. It is Avery's burden to provide facts in his motion showing that he could prove at a hearing that Bobby was responsible for those searches and that they would actually establish a motive for this murder. With no facts pled that could establish that Bobby conducted these searches and viewed this pornography, that it was at all relevant, let alone similar to what happened to the victim in this case, and that they were conducted before the murder occurred. The circuit court was correct that Avery failed to approach the threshold of making a plausible, factually supported motive argument. 3. The circuit court properly found that the first two are in the other video. The circuit court properly found that Avery failed to plead facts showing that Bobby Dassey had the opportunity to commit this crime or stage this scene. The second prong of the legitimacy test asks whether the alleged third-party perpetrator could have committed the crime in question. Evaluation of this prong is guided by the defense's theory that the third party's involvement in the crime. Sometimes opportunity can be established by simply showing the third party was at the crime scene, when as here the third party lived at the crime scene. When as here the theory of how the third party committed the crime requires their crime scene. Let me be specific. The third party lives very closely nearby to where they alleged all of this took place. When as here the theory of how the third party committed the crime requires that person to have carried out a series of complicated and difficult tasks, it is not enough to show the third party's mere presence at the scene and an unaccounted for period of time. In this situation, to meet the opportunity prong, the defendant has to offer evidence that the alleged third-party perpetrator had the skills, contacts, tools, time, and/or other means necessary to have committed the crime and staged the scene in the manner the defendant alleges. In other words, evidence that the third party had the realistic ability to engineer such a scenario. Circuit Court appropriately concluded that Avery's submissions did not meet this threshold. Avery's claims that the opportunity element has already been decided because pre-trial in 2007, the Circuit Court found opportunity by virtue of Bobby's presence on the property. But that fails to acknowledge that Steven Avery's defense theory has changed drastically from the time of the trial. Then its contention, they talked about this already, then his contention was that he was framed by law enforcement who had plenty of time, knowledge, and access to the evidence to plausibly doctor the crime scene. To plausibly doctor the crime scene to meet the opportunity prong, then he only had to show that the alleged third-party perpetrator had the opportunity to kill the victim. Because his theory was that the police framed him, now he claims that his nephew, Bobby Dassey, planted all of the evidence against him and did so in a very short period of time. That means to sufficiently plead his motion on opportunity, he had to provide more than just a showing that Bobby was physically present and had access to the evidence. He had to provide facts showing that Bobby had the realistic ability to engineer such a scenario, meaning a realistic ability to both commit and murder and then complete each step of this framing process, and to do so before November 5th. And Avery did not provide facts that would establish at least 4 key components necessary to sufficiently plead that Bobby Dassey had the opportunity to kill the victim and plant all the evidence against Avery: the why, the when, the where, and the how. Assuming for the sake of argument that Avery had pled the facts that would establish motive to Bobby's motive to kill in the first place, and as explained, he did not. Avery, they had to put that in there. Avery did not offer anything that would suggest why Bobby would want to frame Avery. That's easy. So he himself, Bobby, didn't go to prison, especially given the grave risks and extreme difficulty of doing so. The extreme risk would definitely be worth the reward if he was successful. The risk of doing all of this and being successful means he doesn't have to go to prison. So that would be a risk definitely worth taking, I would assume. Avery did not offer anything that would suggest why Bobby would want to frame Avery, especially given the grave risks and extreme difficulty of doing so. Anyone who murders someone typically wants to escape detection, but that does not explain why Bobby would frame Avery for it. I just easily explained that, especially when doing so would ensure that law enforcement would be taking an intense look at the entire property and everyone who lived on it. He offered no reason why Bobby would want to send him to prison. So Bobby didn't send himself to prison. That's the reason. Nor has Avery explained why someone who wanted to frame him would go to such lengths to hide the evidence, because he didn't want to go to prison. Surely if Bobby or anyone else wanted to frame Avery, they wouldn't have gone out of their way to make all of the evidence difficult for law enforcement to detect, gather, and connect to Avery. That might be the most ridiculous sentence in all of these filings. It makes no sense to burn the victim's remains and personal property in attempt to conceal them. Of course it does. Wild. Or to drip Avery's blood around the RAV4, but then remove the license plate from an attempt to hide the vehicle by covering it with debris. They covered it with sticks, debris away from Avery's trailer, and provide no facts explaining why Bobby Dassey's framing him is plausible, when he has given no reason whatsoever explaining why Bobby would do this. Even if you believe Stephen Avery is guilty of this crime, the way that they go about explaining everything was hid and made difficult to find when they found everything relatively quick, and the RAV4 was hidden with sticks off to the side where anybody could just stumble upon it. Not like whoever did this did a terrific job, and why wouldn't? And if the crime was indeed committed in Stephen Avery's bedroom, like has been alleged, why is there no DNA left of Stephen Avery or Brendan Dassey or Teresa Halbach or nothing else for that matter? But yet he leaves his blood in the car. They clean the bedroom up and leave no trace of anything, but yet leave evidence all over the RAV4? Like, it makes no sense. No sense. Zero sense. Where did I leave off? More importantly, Avery's argument fundamentally failed on the when and the how Bobby could have committed the murder or planted any of the evidence. He provided nothing that could possibly establish. I never actually thought of that before, about how they cleaned up all of the evidence in the bedroom, allegedly, but yet there's all kinds of evidence left in the RAV4. He provided nothing that could possibly establish that Bobby had the knowledge, skills, tools, or time to engineer this elaborate ruse. The mere fact that Bobby was on the Avery property at some time when Avery's hand was bleeding falls far short of facts necessary to establish that Bobby had the opportunity to successfully orchestrate this extremely complicated supposed frame-up. The complete absence of the necessary facts to support several crucial elements of how Bobby could have accomplished staging this scene demonstrates that Avery failed to plead sufficient facts to show that Bobby had any opportunity to kill the victim and frame Avery in this manner. Avery offered no facts at all in this motion that would establish how Bobby Dassey, an 18-year-old high school graduate with no criminal record whatsoever and who was working third shift at a furniture factory, managed to steal at some identified time prior to October 31st the rifle hanging above Avery's bed with which the victim was shot, and at some other unidentified time before November 5th, managed to replace it with Avery never noticing. Could have abducted and killed the victim and hidden both her body and her car in some unspecified area in the minutes between her arrival on the property and Scott Tadek passing Bobby Dassey on the highway around 3 p.m. on October 31st, 2005, nor did Avery provide any facts to establish where the killing could have happened apart from a nondescript, or where Bobby could have hidden the RAV4 and the victim's remains in the short period of time. They've talked about where the RAV4 was stored ad nauseum or hidden ad nauseum. People saw it, allegedly. And number 3, had the scientific sophistication and knowledge necessary for it to occur to Bobby to collect, transport, and plant Stephen Avery's blood from his sink, as Avery completely overlooked in his motion his non-blood touch DNA on the hood latch of the victim's RAV4 and her keys, or how Bobby acquired the skills and knowledge to do this successfully, and had a convenient stash of unidentified instruments capable of collecting and transporting liquid and touch DNA on hand, or what those might have been. 5. Planted the keys to the RAV4 in Stephen Avery's trailer, unnoticed, on an unspecific time between November 3rd and November 5th, yet also either managed to move the RAV4 off the 40-acre property without the keys to drive it away and returned it on foot from wherever he supposedly took it, and then sneak into Avery's trailer again to hide the keys at some other unidentified time, once again unnoticed. Stephen Avery isn't home. They live like right next to each other, or very, very close to each other. He could have easily just went over and been like, pop, there goes the keys. 6. Found and then planted a tiny mangled bullet fragment that Bobby inexplicably knew had the victim's DNA on it underneath items in Avery's garage, or alternatively how he shot the victim in Stephen Avery's garage on October 31st, and then at another unidentified time scrubbed the scene with Avery remaining unaware. This despite Avery's indisputably having been worked on his Suzuki and other vehicles in and around the garage around this time. He's not in there 24/7. Man, some of this stuff's ridiculous. Burned the victim's body in some undisclosed location. Even if you believe he's guilty, some of this stuff's ridiculous. Burned the victim's body in some undisclosed location and then moved the remains to Avery's burn pit, again completely undetected, and did it so thoroughly as to include at least a fragment or more of almost every bone below the neck in the entire human skeleton, along with the rivets from her jeans. Nor did Avery provide any facts showing where and when this occurred. Convinced his younger brother Brendan to go along with this plan and fabricate a confession implicating not only Avery but also himself, or why Brendan would do so. Even if one accepts at face value Avery's theory that Bobby was scientifically sophisticated and equipped enough for it to occur to him to do all of this blood evidence gathering and planting, Stephen Avery provided nothing that would explain how Bobby could have done so in the roughly half an hour before the blood would have coagulated or dried while Avery was at Menards on November the 3rd, and Avery did not plead even a single fact to establish how or when Bobby could have planted any of the rest of the mountain of forensic evidence against Stephen Avery. The victim's remains, the non-blood DNA evidence, and the bullet, and also unsuccessfully eliminate from the scene any trace of his own involvement or physical presence. There's no physical presence of Brendan Dassey being involved in any of this either. But, you know, he sits in jail. In sum, Avery provided no facts in his motion that would establish why Bobby would want to frame him, or when, where, or how Bobby could have even possibly accomplished any of the necessary tasks to make this theory plausible. He supplied nothing other than a series of constantly shifting affidavits about his and others' activities during the relevant time frame, and then backfilled it with speculation with zero factual support about, these would be much shorter if they didn't repeat themselves multiple times, and backfilled it with speculation with zero factual support about how a small fraction of the evidence against him, the blood and the car only, could have ended up where it was if someone else was the perpetrator and pretended the rest of the evidence does not exist. That is flatly insufficient to provide facts that could show that Bobby Dassey had the opportunity to engineer this complicated scheme. Stephen Avery has attempted to cure this failure on appeal by offering up previous statements about what his experts purportedly found regarding the physical evidence, which this court already rejected as misleading and irrelevant speculation. Avery did not provide these theories to the circuit court, so they couldn't form the basis for relief now, even if they had some substance. Regardless, inaccurate statements and speculation do not even show the possibility. Avery further misses the point when he contends he was less qualified to commit the murder than Bobby Dassey because he had less education and never held a job. Obviously, no qualifications are required to commit murder, but if Avery wants to contend a specific person committed this murder and then framed him for it, he has to provide facts plausibly showing that the person was actually capable of doing so and also capable of staging all of the evidence. He did not come close. Avery has abandoned all argument that he can meet Wilson's requirements and instead tries to distinguish it because it was not a case about someone alleging being framed. That is irrelevant. The Wisconsin Supreme Court made crystal clear in Wilson that it is the defense's theory of the third party's involvement that indicates what must be shown to establish opportunity. When that requires the third party to perform a series of complicated tasks, the defendant has to show that the third party realistically has the skills, tools, time, and abilities to do so. Wilson. This is because Denny's legitimate tendency test requires more than mere possibility that another person committed the crime. Nor does State versus another case. There, the victim, Angela H., was murdered in a very specific manner, having been raped, chained to a tree. Man, there's some disturbing human beings out there, and shot. The alleged third-party perpetrator, Kim Brown, had confessed to and was in prison for committing an identical murder of Linda N. 6 weeks after Angela's murder. The only difference was that Angela's murder occurred 30 miles away from Brown's home, whereas Linda was killed 7 miles away. Much like in Dressler, Brown owned a revolver and books involving rape and chains and torture, and told multiple people he enjoyed binding and torturing women. Yeesh! The defense had been investigating Brown as a potential third-party suspect pre-trial, but was erroneously misinformed by law enforcement that Brown was at work when Angela's murder occurred, but he'd actually clocked out at 5 p.m. the day before. The circuit court granted VOLLBRECHT's motion for a new trial, finding that Brown had motive, a direct connection to the crime, through his confession to the identical murder of Linda, an hour and a half window of opportunity to murder Angela, and that he was in the general area at the time. This court held that in light of the very strong evidence of motive and direct connection, proclusivity for rape and torture, his statements to others, the items found at his home, and the unusual identical manner in which Brown admittedly murdered Linda, the fact that Brown lived within 30 miles of the crime scene and had an hour and 30 minutes window of opportunity to commit the crime was sufficient under Sullivan to come in as other acts, evidence proving Brown's identity as the perpetrator. That is nothing at all like what Avery attempts here. His motive evidence totals 3 possible searches for pornography predating the murder that he cannot even actually connect to Bobby Dassey, and that have no relation to the manner in which the homicide occurred. Avery provided only wildly implausible conjecture with no facts showing that Bobby Dassey had the knowledge, tools, time, or ability to commit the crime and stage the evidence, where most of which he ignored and did not account for, whereas in that other case there was no special scenario that had to be achieved. The perpetrator simply needed the time to kill the victim, and the state will explain below. Avery provided 0 facts directly connecting Bobby Dassey to the actual killing or even to the victim's vehicle. That is not true. Where in the other case, Brown was known to have performed the exact same extreme and unusual acts performed on Angela against other women, confessed to people that he liked to do so, was in the general area at the time, and the murders were near in time and place. Talk about another case here, State versus KNAPP. The alleged third-party perpetrator was the victim's husband, Brunner, who had a key to the victim's home in which she was found beaten to death, with whom she had been fighting, was overheard saying he wished he had a bat, and who had been physically violent toward her shortly before. Hearsay statements from Brunner's girlfriend's roommate's friend that Brunner and his girlfriend stopped by the apartment late at night on the night of the murder and left shortly after with a paper bag, contradicted what Brunner told police about his whereabouts that evening, for which he'd given them an alibi stating he was miles away. Knapp's theory of Brunner's involvement required no skill or ability to accomplish. He had a key to the home and had threatened to beat his wife with a bat, and his motive was plain, and therefore the evidence showing that Brunner's alibi was false and he was in close proximity to the crime scene that night met the Denny test. Here, Bobby's mere presence at the Avery property and 2 vague affidavits contending he had a RAV4 5 days after the victim's murder do nothing to establish any fact showing he could have actually accomplished committing this murder and planting all of the evidence in this case. The circuit court correctly determined that Avery did not plead facts in this motion that could establish Bobby's opportunity to commit this crime and stage this scene. The circuit court properly found that Avery did not plead sufficient facts or any facts directly connecting Bobby Dassey to the perpetration of the murder. Direct connection is assessed by considering the preferred evidence in conjunction with all the other evidence to determine whether, under the totality of the circumstances, the evidence suggests that the third-party perpetrator actually committed the crime and take the defendant's theory beyond mere speculation. No bright lines can be drawn as to what constitutes a third party's direct connection to a crime, but it must be more than a connection between the third party and the crime. It requires some direct connection between the third party and the perpetration of the crime. Avery claimed that he met the direct connection prong because Thomas Sawinski claimed to have seen Bobby Dassey pushing a RAV4 on November 5th, 2005. He's wrong. Thomas Sawinski's advertisements that he saw Bobby and someone else pushing a RAV4 on November 5th, several days after Teresa Halbach's murder, do not provide a link between Bobby Dassey and the perpetration of the murder, nor any factual link between Bobby Dassey and any of the forensic evidence. At most generous, the affidavits Avery submitted could establish that Bobby was involved in moving the RAV4 to a location where it was eventually found, that there is nothing more than a possible connection between the third party and the crime. It provides no link at all between Bobby Dassey and the perpetration of the actual killing, and given that Thomas Sawinski and Thomas Burish aver that they saw 2 people, it does not even connect Bobby to the crime because he wasn't in exclusive possession of whatever vehicle they saw. It also provides no connection. Imagine having 2 people saying they saw something very similar and then not doing anything about it. It also provides no connection between Bobby and any of the physical evidence. As the circuit court observed, Stephen Avery's contention that this perpetrated sighting of Bobby Dassey pushing a vehicle means Bobby was in possession of the victim's car key and electronics is nothing more than speculation by the defendant. Thomas Sawinski never says he saw Bobby with any keys or electronics or any of the other victim's effects. In fact, Thomas Sawinski says these individuals were pushing the vehicle, suggesting that they were not in possession of the key. Meanwhile, Thomas Bursch says he saw Bobby driving the car the same night. Maybe they didn't drive it because they didn't want to make a lot of noise and they were just pushing it to try and be quiet. I don't know, that kind of makes sense. Meaning Stephen Avery's purported evidence is contradictory, and he provides no facts showing how Bobby could have planted the victim's car keys in Avery's trailer in either scenario. Thomas Sawinski's and Thomas Bursch affidavits also do nothing to establish that Avery was not the killer. Even if believed, all Sawinski's evidence would show is that perhaps Bobby was involved in trying to cover up Avery's crime. That is far and away the most natural interpretation of the information. That's not true. Imported by Thomas Sawinski and Thomas Bursch when considered in light of the existing evidence, even assuming both that their statements were accurate and that the car Bobby was seen with was the victim's. After all, Avery recruited Brendan to help him cover his tracks. The same could be true about Bobby. Direct connection required. If that is true, why is he not getting charged with like manipulating evidence, hiding a crime scene, falsifying evidence, or whatever else the laws would be? If he was doing all of this to cover up the murder, why isn't more being done in that case? Direct connection requires showing that under the totality of the circumstances, the evidence suggests that a third-party perpetrator actually committed the crime. Nothing Thomas Sawinski or Thomas Bursch ever connects Bobby to the actual killing in any way. Bursch's claims are even more generic and speculative than Sawinski's. They do not provide a description of the vehicle he purportedly saw, just that he saw a RAV4 driving south on County Q, again 5 days after the murder. That establishes nothing suggesting whomever was in the car killed the victim. It doesn't even plausibly establish that the victim's RAV4 is the car he saw. He gives a vague description of seeing news about the trial in 2006 and 2007 and says he saw, and that's how he somehow recognized Bobby as the driver a year later, but Avery provided nothing showing that Bobby was ever on any news reports during that time. And yet Bursch cannot describe the other passenger at all beyond someone being 100% sure it was not Stephen Avery, though he says he knows none of the Avery or Dassey family members. No, but Stephen Avery was likely all over the news at that point, so you probably got pretty familiar with how his face looks. As the circuit court aptly observed, conclusionary assumptions drawn from evidence offered in the affidavits do not amount to evidence directly linking Bobby to the homicide itself, particularly when coupled with Avery's utter lack of facts establishing Bobby's motive or opportunity, and nothing tying him to even a single piece of the forensic evidence. Thomas Sawinski and Thomas Bursch's advertisements amount to nothing. They do not even state facts that would establish that whomever they saw was, man, they said this like 37 times, they was actually in possession of the victim's car. It was not only the RAV4 in existence. It was not the only RAV4 in existence. Avery's multiple layers of that. People are going to have a field day with that sentence, by the way. Avery's multiple layers of conjecture piled on top of, because a lot of people think there's more than one RAV4 involved in this crime. Avery's multiple layers of conjecture piled on top of an allegation that Thomas Sawinski maybe saw Bobby and a second person pushing a car similar to the victim's at some point, while Bursch claims he saw two people driving one, do nothing to establish any fact showing a legitimate tendency that Bobby actually committed the murder. Versus Williams, upon which Avery attempts to rely, has failed to provide incorrect citation format, identifying it as an unpublished opinion, predates July 1st, 2009, and is not citable. The state does not discuss it further. In short, the tendency that Bobby committed this crime based on what Avery has presented here has not entered the ballpark of legitimate. The state does not dispute the facts, give meaning to other facts, but requires Avery to have provided some actual facts on all three prongs of Denny. Avery's allegations are conjecture and speculation plugged to an unaccounted for periods of time of Bobby's time. That is and always has been insufficient to meet Denny. The dearth of facts in Avery's motion necessary to establish Bobby's motive or opportunity to commit this crime and then carry out this elaborate planting scheme, along with nothing tying Bobby to perpetration of the actual killing or any of the forensic evidence, means Avery has failed to establish a legitimate tendency that Bobby was the killer. Avery thus failed to meet his pleading burden on his newly discovered evidence claim. No hearing is necessary. D. Even if Avery could have met the three prongs of the Denny, there is no reasonable probability that presenting Avery's defense would change the result of the trial. If the newly discovered evidence presented by a defendant would be inadmissible at trial, there is no way it could impact the jury's evaluation of other evidence, and that the defendant fails to meet his burden. Avery's latest attempt at a Denny defense would not be admissible, meaning there is no probability of a different result at trial based on it. The Denny test is a three-pronged test. It never becomes a one- or two-pronged test. If a defendant fails to make an adequate showing of any of the prongs, the third-party perpetrator evidence is inadmissible. Avery failed to meet his burden on all three prongs of the test. He failed to connect Bobby to the pornography or the pornography to the crime for the motive. Opportunity defense is flatly insufficient to establish that Bobby could have committed the crime or staged the crime scene, and his direct connection evidence doesn't establish a connection between Bobby and the actual killing. Accordingly, no jury would ever be presented with what Avery has submitted here, and therefore there is no possibility it could affect the outcome at a new trial. Even assuming that Avery's new witness testimony was sufficient to meet Denny, and Avery had a new trial presenting this defense instead of the police bias defense, there is still no probability that any jury hearing it would have reasonable doubt about Avery's guilt. Accordingly, he could not meet the final requirement for asserting a newly discovered evidence claim. As explained above, there are far too many irreconcilable inconsistencies between Stephen Avery's allegations about Bobby Dassey and the actual evidence produced at trial. Particularly fatal would be Avery's complete failure to account for his DNA on the hood latch of the RAV4. Kathleen Zellner has done that previously, of the RAV4 and Teresa Hallbach's remains, again including a fragment from virtually every bone in the human body being found in his burn pit, and nothing to explain how Bobby could possibly be responsible for the bullet with Teresa Hallbach's DNA on it being found in his garage and matched to the gun above his bed. More so, the state would negate whatever little credibility Thomas Sawinski and Thomas Burish had on the stand. It could easily impeach Thomas Sawinski with the glaring inconsistencies between his latest story and Thomas Sawinski's prior statement Stephen Avery submitted previously. The information Thomas Sawinski initially provided to counsel does not at all match what his affidavits now say about what or who he observed, when he observed them, or when he spoke to the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office, and what their response was. And in fact, Thomas Sawinski's original information to current defense counsel would have eliminated Bobby Dassey as a suspect because Bobby was at work during the time frame Thomas Sawinski gave. Thomas Sawinski's account changed drastically after somehow having his memory refreshed by counsel and her investigations, with no documentation that would show how this memory refreshment could have been achieved, and this second person he purportedly saw has never been identified, meaning Sawinski's information could not have actually pointed to Bobby as the perpetrator. Thomas Burish generic claims suffers similar failings, in particular his failure to explain why he did not bring this information to any of Stephen Avery's attorneys until nearly 20 years after the murder, and after Avery's latest attorney put up a $100,000 bounty for witnesses. Avery's new defense would essentially be just asking the jury to ignore the evidence introduced against him when presented with the common sense explanation that the evidence was located where it was because Avery shot and killed the victim after luring her to the property and unsuccessfully attempted to hide the evidence of this crime, versus Avery's attempt to paint the then teenage Bobby as a porn-obsessed, scientifically savvy, and extraordinarily stealthy criminal mastermind who inexplicably wanted to frame his uncle. No one would have reasonable doubt about Avery's guilt. Courts may permissibly find, as a matter of law, that no reasonable jury could determine that the third-party perpetrated the crime in light of overwhelming evidence that he or she did not. Here, overwhelming evidence that Bobby did not commit the crime exists in the utter absence of any facts tying him to the actual killing, or even a single piece of the forensic evidence. Jurors are instructed to use their common sense when reaching a verdict, that the arguments of the attorneys are not evidence, and that a trial is a search for the truth. Any reasonable juror being asked for a search for the truth of this murder would reject Avery's absurd defense without fail. E. Avery's claims that the circuit court's factual findings are unsupported by the evidence is false. Mistakes the court made are immaterial. Finally, Avery takes issue with several bits of minute that he contends that the court got wrong about the record. He has misunderstood the record for most of them, and he fails to show that any of them matter. Avery's complaint about the circuit court once referenced Brian Dassey instead of Bobby Dassey trivial. That was plainly a typographical error by the court. Moreover, the circuit court was correctly that only a small number of the searches Avery claims only Bobby could have been responsible for took place before the murder occurred. As explained, the evidence Avery submitted showed only 3 searches taking place between 7 a.m. and 3:45 p.m. on a weekday before the murder occurred. He now claims that it was error on the part of the circuit court to find, but he points only to McCrary's affidavit referencing that the September 18, 2005 searches as support, and that the affidavit offers no actual evidence about who conducted the searches, nor showing that they're at all related to this crime. And again, September 18th, 2005 was a Sunday. Any of the people they invited over for their Sunday porn searches could have performed these searches. Avery's next claims there is no evidence that Teresa Halbach was murdered on October 31st, 2005, and the circuit court got that wrong. That is absurd. The first wealth of evidence introduced at the 5-week trial at which he was convicted of committing the murder plainly shows otherwise. Next, Stephen Avery complains that the circuit court erred in stating that some of the victim's bones were found in his burn barrel. True, but immaterial. Teresa Halbach's electronics were found in Avery's burn barrel. Her remains were found in multiple locations, but the primary site was Avery's burn pit, proved by the forensic anthropologist who found at least one fragment from nearly every bone in the human body within it, as the circuit court correctly observed. The 40 to 60% of the bones comprising the complete skeleton to which Avery refers was the expert's testimony that about half of the total skeleton was destroyed in the fire. In other words, parts of each bone were destroyed, but parts of each remained, and the jury was not unconvinced that Teresa Halbach was burned by Stephen Avery in his burn pit because he was acquitted of mutilation of Teresa Halbach's body. A judgment of acquittal is not proof of innocence. It is a judgment that the state didn't meet its burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt each element of the crime. Given that the common definition of mutilate is to cut up and alter radically, it is not surprising that the jury acquitted on this account. The state could not provide evidence of what state Teresa Halbach's remains were in when Avery put her body in the fire because so little remained intact. That does not mean Avery did not burn Teresa Halbach's remains in his burn pit. There was no error in relying in part on Brendan Dassey's confession to reject Avery's purported Denny defense. The fact that Brendan both confessed and implicated Stephen Avery as part of the record, and Brendan was convicted of this crime regardless of the fact he wasn't forensically linked to it. So it is a fact Avery must account to show how a legitimate tendency Bobby committed the crime, no matter whether the state introduced it at the last trial. Avery failed to provide any facts explaining why or how Bobby Dassey could have been responsible for Brendan's confession. Avery failed to show that the circuit court committed any factual errors about his failure to provide any actual evidence in his motion on the three prongs of Denny. And he fails to show how any of the perpetrated errors of which he complains make any difference to its findings that he did not meet them. The circuit court properly denied Stephen Avery's insufficiently pled motion without a hearing. Conclusion: this court should affirm circuit court on this day, April 15th, 2024, respectfully submitted, and it lists the attorneys. Whew, what do you think? Let me know. Leave some comments below. I hope you're having a good day, and I will see you again soon.